This was the first time that Max had visited the hospital and was impressed by the size and the professionalism of it. It was Gussersberg Hospital in Leuven, a university teaching hospital that had a reputation around the world. John had been lucky that this had been the local hospital close to where he lived and had been transferred there quickly and efficiently. Kurt parked his car in the visitors' car park and the two of them walked into the large, spacious reception area. He spoke to the receptionist in Dutch and they were given directions to the intensive care unit. Together they crossed the floor and took one of the elevators up to the third floor. The intensive care unit was a short corridor, and then they arrived there where there were one or two people waiting outside the doors. The doors were closed and entry to the unit was carefully controlled. They only allowed 2 or 3 people in at one time to see each patient. Max and Kurt took a seat at the side of the corridor and waited for someone to open the doors at the far end of the corridor. After a few minutes, one of the nurses came into the corridor and opened the doors. Each of them stood up and made their way slowly into the hospital ward. John was lying on his back in the bed closest to the doors. He was unconscious and a variety of tubes were attached to his body. He had a tube down his throat and an oxygen tube attached to his nostrils. There was also a monitor at the side of the bed that was showing his heartbeat and other physical attributes. His head was wrapped in bandages. Kurt and Max walked up to his bed and looked down at him. He looked peaceful, but there was very little that they could do. Kurt reached over and took his hand. Gently he held it and talked to John. Max stood at the other side of the bed and felt as though he was intruding. Kurt was clearly upset and he felt as though he could perhaps, or maybe he should, just leave them alone. Max took John's other hand and squeezed it gently. He knew he was unconscious, but he just wanted John to know that he was there for him. There was nothing that he could do for John, but he knew he was in good hands. The nurse came over to Kurt and talked to him in Dutch. John had been put into an induced coma, which was usual in these cases. Keeping such patients in a coma was now how to aid their recovery. At the moment his body's signs were stable, but they were sure that he would survive with the correct care. There was one problem though. John had hit his head when he fell and had cracked his skull. At the time they didn't think it was serious, but they were afraid that there may be some brain damage. They wouldn't know what extent of damage. That would have to wait for later. For now they were concentrating on his bodily care and were hoping that he would recover well. For now he would have to stay in intensive care for at least a few weeks. Later he would be transferred to another ward with more general care, but for now he needed to stay in this ward where the nursing staff could take better care of him. He would have to stay in the coma, though, until his doctors were sure it would be safe to bring him out of it. For Max and Kurt they would have to wait. They would visit him daily, but there was nothing else they could do. They had to just wait and put their faith in the hospital staff. The hospital had an excellent reputation in the field of neurology, and for now he was in the best place. Kurt and Max left the hospital and drove back to Moselstraat. They would have to just wait and see what happens. He was safe now. He was still alive, and if it hadn't been for Karen stopping at the house and finding him, he would probably now be dead. There was Wotan, of course. This deserved extra treats for him. Kurt and Max found themselves living together in the house without John. They had to reorganize themselves and make sure that Wotan was taken care of. They had agreed that They would both visit John every evening in the hospital. This was at least what they could do. Karen had asked to go, so Max had given up his seat so that she could go with Kurt. Max had offered to prepare the evening meal. He was a reasonable cook and thought that it would be no great hardship for him to cook each evening, as he collected a wide range of meal ideas over the years. He could manufacture a quick meal from almost anything. It might not be high cuisine, but he knew how to cook a satisfying meal that people generally enjoyed. It was strange to be in the house without John. John had his problems. He could be difficult, and his behavior had been getting worse. But John was a force of nature. He had never lost his love of life, and the idea that he would attempt suicide was ridiculous. To Max, at least, he thought he knew him well, perhaps better than most people, and John was not suicidal. Now, though, that thought was irrelevant now. The most important thing now was for John to get better and hopefully come home. It would now be weeks and perhaps even months, but they would still be there. Wotan would still be there, but he was confused by the situation. He was missing John as well and couldn't understand why he was not around the house. Perhaps the dog had realized that he'd saved his life, and perhaps not. Max now had a closer relationship with him, and he rarely left his side while he was in the house. Max had always noticed that he would come up to him for a cuddle before he was settled down in his bed in the hallway. Max would be sitting on the sofa by the lounge window, and Max would walk up to him and just stand there. He would even make a point of positioning himself so that he was against the sofa with his head next to Max. It was only after Max had given him a cuddle for a few minutes would he then leave the lounge and head off to bed. For Max, it would be known as a worty cuddle, and it would be something that he would remember, something that would stay with him for many years. It was another man-dog moment that he would treasure for years. The house felt empty. That after years when they were used to be calling around and coming over for barbecues during the warm summer months, Karen was still a regular visitor, but many of their friends were now staying away. It was at times like this that you begin to realize who your true friends are. It is in times of difficulty that your friends come around. It was at this time that Max was surprised by who did care about him and who didn't. He had no family here in Belgium, so John couldn't rely on them. He did have his mother in Britain, and he had relatives in Australia. None of them had been in touch, and as long as Max had known, John had never contacted them. Kurt had said that they had rejected him years ago because he was gay. John had felt this deeply, and it was another rejection that had become part of his personality, one of his demons that haunted him. Kurt and Max were here, and they were not going anywhere. Karen was still very supportive, and they valued her help. There were also a few other people in Brussels who John had known over the years, but he wouldn't have considered them as close friends. Now, though, they were calling and asking if they could go to the hospital to see him. As visiting hours were limited and the numbers allowed at one time were also restricted, Max held back and allowed Kurt to go with these different people. It was good that they cared. Max even made a few new friends. For the time being, it was John who was at the center, and anything that helped him to get better was all that Max wanted. He did feel a bit left out sometimes. He felt as though he was a stranger in this scenario, but he didn't mind that. It was John who was important. He was happy to stay behind while Kurt went to the hospital every evening. He would stay here with Wotan, and they would keep each other company. After a few weeks in the intensive care, John was moved into another ward where he would receive more general care from the doctors and the nurses. He was in a small room with 2 beds. The other bed was empty, so he was on his own. He was still in an induced coma and was connected to a variety of hospital equipment. The nurse had explained that he would stay in a coma for a little while longer until the doctors were sure that he was strong enough. Then he would be slowly brought out of unconsciousness, and they would be in a better place to evaluate any long-term damage. Visiting was easier, as there was no restrictions on how many people could be there at one time. A few of his friends were now turning up on his own, and some had a special journey from quite some kilometers away. They were all welcomed, especially by Kurt, who was surprised and even pleased by how many people really cared about John. For Max, this was a good period. John was getting stronger, and the hospital staff was sure he would make a real recovery time. It was difficult to see him unconscious, but it would not be long until the staff would bring him out of this state and he would once again be awake. The problem, though, was his brain damage. Would it be so severe that he could lose a lot of his functions? Hopefully it would be mild, and that he would be able to live a normal life. The one thing that both Kurt and Max feared was that John's brain damage was so severe that he would be little more than a vegetative state. They both wanted the real John back, as noisy and stupid and funny as he had always been. The idea of John living out the rest of his life living in a non-existence was more than they could bear. Back at the house each evening, they didn't discuss the possibility. They were both sure he would survive and return to the house as the real John, the one they had known, the one they had both loved in their different ways, but loved John for what he was, but why he was there. Neither of them wanted to lose him. Neither of them wanted to be put in the position of being his long-term carer. They would care for him if it was necessary, but they didn't want a John back who could not look after himself and live a normal life like anyone else. He didn't deserve this. He would hate it. The day finally came, though, when the hospital staff told Kurt that they would be bringing John out of his coma. The doctors had felt that he was now strong enough, and they needed to assess him further. This they could only do while he was awake. It would take a few days before he was fully conscious, but this was it. For both Kurt and Max, it was a nervous time. It would be done slowly, so they had to wait until he was finally awake. The one thing that concerned them most was, would he know them? When he woke up, would he recognize them? Or would he have lost his memory? For Kurt, this was the most worrying time. He had already lived through the time when he thought that John would die. Now he would have to face up to the idea that John had changed. That he was no longer the person that he had fallen in love with. That John wouldn't recognize him or remember him. Max now found that he was caring and supportive. Kurt faced this moment. The day arrived when John was finally awake. It had taken 1 or 2 days to reach this point after they had stopped the medication that had kept him in the coma. When Kurt and Max walked into the hospital room, he was sitting up in bed. He was still connected to a machine beside his bed, but this was only to monitor his heartbeat and was connected to his finger. The tubes were gone, but he still had a bandage wrapped around his head. They walked quickly into the room, and 2 on either side of the bed. John turned his head and looked at them. He appeared happy to see them. At the one first and then the other, he seemed a bit confused and said nothing. Kurt held his hand and started talking to him. He looked confused, but there was a smile on his face, and it said everything. The nurse explained that he would need time to come fully awake, so not to expect any great response from him. He would be confused from time to time, but they were generally glad to see him sitting up. Next, Max spoke to him and held his other hand. John looked down at the touch of his hand and then up at him. His gaze seemed distant, and he looked over again at Kurt. He was awake, and he looked as though he recognized them. After a few minutes, he put his head back on the pillow and appeared that he wanted to sleep. He still said nothing. He just laid his head on one side while Kurt spoke to him. They both just talked to him, telling him about what had happened, about the house, about Karen and the other friends who had come to see him while he was in a coma. It would take some time before the efforts of the accident would wear off. Then the serious business of assessing John would have to start. No one was sure what would be the result of the accident, and especially his hit on the head. At the moment, they were not sure if there would be any permanent brain damage. Only further tests and time would tell. But in the meantime, he was awake, and he was getting stronger. So far, his doctors were happy with his progress. Only time would tell how much he had really been damaged. There was no doubt that Kurt and Max would have to be there for him and give him all the support that they could. Without his family, John had no one. Now Kurt and Max would have to be his family, and this was something that both of them were prepared to do, as long as it took. They wanted him back. They wanted John to be back as he was before, the John that they knew, the real John, who was the life and soul of the party, the confident John before the choir, before the emails, before all this had happened. It was possible. They believed, both of them, that it was possible to return to the past, to return to that time when life was good, and they were all together in Moselstraat. They would make it possible. As the weeks went by and John got stronger, he started to speak. At times he became confused and would look at Kurt and Max as though he didn't understand. There was no language damage, as you sometimes get with heart attacks. His language appeared to be intact, and he could talk clearly, which was a good sign. He did sometimes have problems following conversations, but some degree of difficulty was only to be suspected after what he'd been through. No, he didn't remember the accident. He didn't remember anything about the hospital. Everyone had been kind to him and were looking after him well. His memory was slowly returning, and he started asking questions of his own. Thankfully, the events of the accident were completely lost. He didn't remember anything about it. He didn't remember the fall or being in the basement. He didn't remember anything about what had happened before to make him fall. It was all a blank, and both Max and Kurt were grateful for this. For Max, he was particularly glad because shortly after returning back to the house and going to the basement, he had found blood at the bottom of the stairs. What Kurt didn't know about, and what he didn't tell him, was that he had gone into the washroom, which was next to the concrete steps that John had fallen down. He had gone in there with a bucket of water and a cloth to clean up the blood from the floor. What he had found there had particularly upset him. Kurt had always believed that John had fallen down the stairs and had knocked himself down. He had simply laid there at the foot of the stairs until Karen had found him. What Max found showed something completely different, and he hadn't told Kurt. John had not knocked himself out. He had been conscious. He had been awake, because Max had found handprints, blooded handprints, on the floor and on the wall. The blood was streaked across the floor. The deep freeze cabinet had handprints and streaks of blood. Max realized that rather being unconscious, John had been awake and had dragged himself into the washroom. He had pulled himself across the floor. The handprint showed it. He had then tried to pull himself up. He had tried to get up, but couldn't. The evidence showed, the blood showed, the handprint showed. He had tried and tried again and again. He had been awake until he had finally lost the strength. John had been awake. He knew he was hurt. He knew he was bleeding heavily. He had been there, alone, in the basement, on his own, with no one to help him. He had laid there, in his own blood, throughout the night, until he must have passed out. He had spent the night alone, thinking that he would die here, alone, without any help. When Max had seen this, he had broken down. The pain he must have felt, the hopelessness he must have felt. He must have believed that once again he'd been abandoned, and now he must die alone on this cold basement floor. Looking at this, Max had found himself sobbing. He cleaned the room and removed the dry blood, with tears streaking down his face. He was just glad that Kurt had not seen this, and he swore to himself he would never tell them. The thought of it would be too much for him. He knew Kurt, and he knew how sensitive he was, even though he didn't show it. Max knew, though. He had seen it in Kurt since the accident. Kurt, though, had been away enjoying himself with his family, while John was lying on the floor, slowly dying. The guilt for Kurt would have been overwhelming. Max never told Kurt what he'd found, and vowed to himself that he never would. While John was getting stronger, now he could move around the hospital. The doctors had found one problem. There was damage to his brain, and that swelling under his skull was putting pressure on his brain. They would have to operate again. This time they would have to remove the skull bone on the left side of his head. The doctors had assured him completely that this was a perfectly normal procedure in such cases, and there was no need to worry. All they would do is remove the skin and hair of his left side, slice off the bone underneath, and then return the skin. This would leave the brain open without the bone protecting it, but the skin would be sewn back to cover it. Easy. To both Max and Kurt, this sounded gruesome, but John was relaxed about it. He wasn't worried at all. They all agreed that they would make no fuss about this at all, and would simply put their faith in the doctors, who were sure it was a simple procedure. The following day, John had the procedure, and since he had to be put under again, they missed their visitor's time, as he would be asleep. When they did finally see him again afterwards, it was a strange sight to behold. Although John was completely relaxed again about the whole thing, after removing the bone from his skull, the skin was now sat directly on top of his brain, the left side. When you looked at him from the side, there was no real difference. He looked perfectly normal. However, when you looked at him directly at the front, the left side of his head was reduced. At first, Max had laughed and had thought better of it. "What's so funny?" asked John, looking confused. It's nothing," replied Max. It just looked as though someone has erased the left side of your head." "So?" said John, now sounding indignant. It's nothing," said Matt. "It's just that you look as though someone has photoshopped one side of your head. That's all. Your left side has been erased." Very funny, replied John, and then went on to ignore him. It was the first time that Max had laughed for a long time. It felt good.